Before we get into tonight's story, and this one is long, so settle in, I need you to check the description of this video and the pinned comment. There's a link there for the Appalachian dossier. It's a compilation of stories that were quietly erased from official American records between 1843 and 1891. Cases that were closed before they were ever really opened. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know exactly what I mean. The link is right there. Description, pinned comment. Go look after this. Now, there are parts of this country that don't make it onto maps the way they should. Not because the cartographers missed them, because someone decided it was better that way. The Missouri Ozarks, the real ones, not the ones people drive through on their way somewhere else, have a particular kind of quiet. If you've spent time there, you know what I mean. The hills fold into each other in a way that doesn't feel accidental. The trees grow close. The creeks run cold even in August, and the people who've been there long enough stop explaining certain things to outsiders, not because they don't remember, but because they've learned that explaining only makes it worse. Tonight's story spans nearly 5 decades. It begins in 1870 in a narrow valley the locals called Gristle Hollow, tucked so far into the south-central part of the state that the nearest telegraph office was a 2-day ride away. And it ends, if it can be said to end at all, sometime around 1917, when the last person who claimed to understand what happened there finally stopped talking about it. I want to ask you something before we go further. Have you ever been somewhere that felt wrong before anything actually happened? Not a noise, not a sight, just a feeling, like the air itself was telling you to leave. If you've had that, drop it in the comments. I want to know where you were, because the people in this story felt exactly that, and most of them stayed anyway. Gristle Hollow wasn't supposed to be a permanent settlement. It started as a logging camp, the way a lot of Ozark communities did, when a man named Carveth Dunmore, 44 years old, stocky and broad-shouldered, with the kind of hands that had been breaking things and fixing them again since he was old enough to work, decided that the timber in that valley was worth the difficulty of getting to it. Carveth had worked timber operations in 3 states. He knew what he was doing. He knew how to read a forest, how to manage men, how to deal with the particular problems that come from working in isolated terrain far from any town. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was what that valley had already been before anyone thought to cut the trees. Carveth arrived in the late summer of 1870 with 17 men, a dozen draft horses, and enough supplies to last through the winter. They built their first structures at the northern end of the valley, where the ground leveled out near a wide bend in the creek, a main bunkhouse, a cook shed, a stable, a small separate cabin for Carveth himself, which he referred to in his ledger simply as the office, though it served mostly as a place where he could sleep without hearing the other men snore. The work began well. The timber in Gristle Hollow was dense and old. Oak and hickory in the upper reaches, sycamore and cottonwood along the creek bottom, and the men moved through it efficiently in those first weeks. Carveth noted in his ledger that the yields were better than expected. The men were in good spirits. The horses were healthy. He did note one thing that he didn't have a category for. On their second night in the valley, All 17 men independently reported that they had woken at the same time in the night. No one had made a sound. Nothing had disturbed the camp. But all 17 men, and Carveth himself, had come awake at what they later agreed must have been somewhere around 2 or 3 hours past midnight, with the same sensation, that something had moved through the camp, through it, not around it, through the walls. Carveth wrote it off as the kind of collective anxiety that happens when a new crew settles into an unfamiliar place. It had happened before, in other camps. It usually passed in a few days. In Gristle Hollow, it did not pass. By the end of the first month, the nightly wakings had become a regular occurrence. Not every night. That was the strange part. 3 nights would pass without incident, quiet and ordinary. Then, on the 4th night, all of them would be awake at the same time, the same hour, with the same feeling. Some of the men started marking it in their own ledgers, the way you mark a pattern when you can't explain it, but can't ignore it either. What none of them discussed openly, though Carveth suspected they all knew, was the smell. It was there on those nights, and not on the others. Faint, not unpleasant exactly, but wrong, like something green and wet that had been buried, like the inside of a place that hadn't been opened in a very long time. One of the men, a broad-faced Tennessean named Arvid Stain, who had been cutting timber since he was a young man, came to Carveth on a cold October morning and said, plainly and without ceremony, that he thought they were working in a place where something had happened before they arrived. He didn't know what. He said there were places in the hills back home that had that quality, that the land remembered things, that it kept them close. Carveth listened. He didn't disagree. He told Arvid to keep the observation between the two of them. Arvid nodded. Then he said, "I already have been. The winter of 1871 into 1872 was harsh in the Ozarks, and the camp in Gristle Hollow became effectively isolated from late November through mid-March. The men couldn't leave even if they'd wanted to. The snow came in November and stayed. The creek froze solid by December. The supply wagon that was supposed to arrive before the freeze didn't make it through, and so the 17 men and their foreman spent those months eating what they'd stored, burning through their firewood faster than anticipated, and living in very close proximity with each other and with whatever it was in that valley. It was during that winter that the first of the men left. His name was Jessup Moreland, and he was 31 years old, a carpenter from the Boot Heel region of the state who had signed on with Carveth for the season's wages. Jessup was a quiet man, not unfriendly, just contained. He didn't complain. He worked hard. He had, as far as anyone could tell, no particular reason to do what he did. On a night in early February, Jessup got up from his bunk in the middle of the night, dressed himself fully in his outdoor clothing, walked out of the bunkhouse, and did not come back. His tracks went south into the deepest part of the valley. When the others followed them the next morning, the tracks simply stopped. Not at the edge of the creek, not at a tree line, not anywhere that made geographical sense. They stopped in the middle of an open, snow-covered clearing, as though Jessup had stepped out of the world at that particular spot. Carveth searched for 3 days. He found nothing. In his ledger, he wrote, "Jessup Moreland departed February the 9th. Circumstances unknown. Lost to the valley." I do not know what that means, but it is the most accurate description I have. He kept that ledger for the rest of his life. No authority ever read it. When it finally came into the hands of a county historian in the late 1940s, most of the relevant pages had been carefully removed. Spring came to Gristle Hollow the way it always does in the Ozarks, gradually, then all at once. The creek opened, the mud came, the birds returned, and 3 more men came with them. Carveth had sent word to a labor broker in the nearest large town, and by the middle of April he had his full crew back. The 3 new men filling the gaps left by the 2 others who had quietly resigned over the winter, and by Jessup, whose disappearance Carveth had described in the hiring documents simply as a departure during the off-season. The new men were a wiry, sun-darkened figure named Orval Priest, 26 years old, who'd worked in the lead mines down near the Arkansas border. A large, slow-moving man called Haddon Fitch, 38, who'd come from a farm operation in the northern part of the state. And a third man, whose name in the records appears only as Sully, occupation listed as general labor, age estimated at somewhere between 30 and 50. Sully, the surviving accounts agree, was the one who understood what Gristle Hollow was. He didn't say so immediately. He worked through the spring quietly, learning the rhythms of the camp, the layout of the valley, the patterns that the long-term crew had stopped noticing because they'd gotten used to them. He ate his meals. He did his work. He said little. But sometime in June of 1872, he came to Carveth in the late evening and told him that he had been in a place like this before. Not a place like this in terms of geography, he was careful to say. Not a valley in the Ozarks, not a logging camp, not anything so specific as that, but a place where the boundary between what had happened and what was happening had worn thin, where the weight of certain events had pressed through the way water presses through stone if you give it long enough. Carveth asked him where he'd been before. Sully didn't answer that. What he said instead was, "There are places in this country that were used for things that don't have names anymore, things that were done deliberately in specific locations by people who understood that the land retains what's put into it. Whatever was done in this valley, and something was done here, I'm certain of that. It left a mark that goes deep. The trees know it, the water knows it, and the people who stay here long enough begin to know it too, whether they want to or not." Carveth wrote this down. Then he asked, "What happens to the people who stay?" Sully was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That depends on what the place wants from them. Let me stop here for a moment, because I want to make sure you're still with me. You that's been listening since the beginning of this video. You already know this channel doesn't do things halfway. Behind Dark Tales is where we bring you the stories that got buried, the ones that the official record skipped over. If this is your first time here, now is a good time to subscribe. We put out new stories regularly, and the comment section on this channel is genuinely one of the best places on the internet for people who take this kind of history seriously. And if you're watching this on another channel, if someone has re-uploaded this without permission, know that they took this without asking. Report it if you can. It helps us keep doing this. Now, back to Gristle Hollow. The summer of 1872 was the most productive the camp ever had. It was also the strangest. The timber came out fast. The men worked efficiently, almost mechanically, in a way that Carveth later described as unlike anything he'd seen in 20 years of running crews. They rarely complained. They rarely argued. They ate, they worked, they slept. And on the nights when the valley woke them all at the same hour, they lay in their bunks in silence, staring at the ceiling, and waited for it to pass. Arvid Stan started keeping notes of his own. He was, in his own way, a careful observer. Not an educated man, but precise in the way that people who work with their hands tend to be precise, aware of detail, suspicious of vagueness, unwilling to call something one thing when it was clearly another. He recorded the nights when the feeling came. He recorded the smell. He recorded what he called the drift, a quality to the air on certain afternoons, usually just before sunset, when the light in the valley changed in a way he couldn't describe, when the shadows fell at angles that didn't match the sun, when sound carried strangely, voices arriving from distances that seemed too far or too close. He also recorded something that none of the other men mentioned until Arvid wrote it down, at which point several of them acknowledged that they had noticed it too, but hadn't spoken of it. On certain mornings, maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, with no clear pattern, when the men came out of the bunkhouse at first light, the ground around the camp was disturbed, not from animals, not from anything that left tracks. The dirt was simply rearranged in broad arcs and curves, as though something enormous had moved through the camp very slowly in the night, pressing against the earth without lifting itself from it. No footprints, no claw marks, no broken brush, just the weight. Arvid wrote, "Whatever 'tis, it is heavier than anything I have seen, and it moves only when we are asleep, or when it wants us to be." In late August of that same year, one of the new men, Orval Priest, the former mine worker, came to Karveth with a piece of evidence. He'd found it while working the southern end of the valley, the deepest part, where the original stands of old-growth oak came down to the edge of a spring-fed pool that the men had started calling the Black Pool, for reasons that were entirely descriptive and not in any way metaphorical. The water in it was dark, not from contamination as far as anyone could tell, simply dark, the way certain deep water is dark, absorbing light without reflecting it. What Orval had found was buried at the edge of that pool, partially exposed by erosion, a collection of objects. Stones arranged in a deliberate pattern. Pieces of worked metal of a type none of them recognized, flattened and scored with marks that weren't any language Karveth could identify. And beneath those, packed in clay, a series of objects that Orval described to Karveth but refused to remove from the ground. He said, "I know enough to know I don't want to touch those. I don't know what they are, but they were put there on purpose by someone who knew what they were doing, and they've been there for a long time." Karveth went to see for himself. He looked at what Orval had found. Then he told Orval to cover it back up and not mention it to the others. He wrote about it in his ledger in very careful language. He described the arrangement. He described the metal pieces. He stopped before describing the third category of objects, writing only, "The rest I will not put to paper. Some things are made worse by being named." That sentence has stayed with historians who eventually found fragments of the ledger, because Karveth was not by any account a superstitious man. He was a practical, commercial, hard-headed man who ran timber operations and kept meticulous records and did not deal in abstractions. Whatever he saw in that clay by the black pool was enough to change that. The second disappearance happened in October. It wasn't one of the original crew this time. It was Haddon Fitch, the large man from the northern farm country who had seemed by all accounts to be the most settled and unremarkable of all the workers. He had no particular sensitivities, no interest in the strangeness of the valley, no conversations with Sully or Arvid about what they'd observed. He ate his meals, he worked his hours, he slept. And then one morning, he simply wasn't there. His boots were placed neatly beside his bunk. His coat was hung on the peg where he always hung it. His wages, he'd been paid 2 days before, were stacked on the small shelf beside his mattress, untouched. A man who leaves voluntarily takes his wages. The search this time was more thorough, because Carveth had learned from Jessup. He organized the men into groups. He covered the entire valley systematically, from the northern camp down to the Black Pool and beyond, into the rocky upper reaches where the terrain got difficult and the trees grew at angles that made you feel like the ground itself was tilting. They found nothing, not a boot print, not a thread, not a single indication that Haddon Fitch had walked anywhere after he left his bunk. Sully, when Carveth told him what had happened, nodded slowly. He said, "It takes people who don't know what it is. That's the part I should have explained better. The ones who pay attention, who understand what they're in the middle of, they get to be afraid. That's actually a kind of protection. It's the ones who don't notice who are most at risk." Carveth said, "What takes them? Where do they go?" Sully said, "I don't know where. I know they don't come back." By the winter of 1872, the camp at Gristle Hollow had lost 3 men to the valley. Carveth should have closed the operation. He knew this. He wrote as much in his ledger in a long late-night entry from November, when the cold had come back and the valley had settled into its winter silence. He wrote, "Any rational evaluation of this situation leads to one conclusion, which is that this land is not suitable for habitation, and that continued operation here will result in further losses that I will not be able to explain or justify. The timber is good. The wages I can offer on this yield are better than any other operation I could run. But I am beginning to believe that the yield is not worth the cost, and that the cost includes things that do not appear in any ledger." Then, in the very next entry, 3 days later, he wrote about increasing the spring crew by 6 men and beginning work on the eastern slope. He stayed for 8 more years. The question of why has occupied everyone who's looked seriously at this story. The practical explanation is economic. The operation was profitable, and Carveth had invested significantly in the infrastructure of the camp. The other explanation, the one that Sully and Arvid both hint at in the surviving fragments of their own accounts, is something else. That the valley didn't let people leave easily, not through force, not through threat, through something quieter and harder to name, a sense which deepened the longer you stayed, that the rest of the world had become less real, that the valley was the place where things actually mattered, that whatever was happening there, however frightening, was more true than anything outside. Arvid wrote it plainly. "I have thought about leaving every single day since October, and every time I think about leaving, the world outside the valley feels like a story I told myself once. I can't make it seem real anymore. I think that's what it does. I think that's how it keeps people. Now, here's what I want you to think about for a moment. Have you ever been somewhere, a place, a situation, a relationship, where you knew you should leave, but the idea of leaving felt impossible? Not dangerous, not difficult, just unreal, like the exit didn't actually exist, even though you could see it? Drop that in the comments. Seriously, I want to know. Because what Arvid is describing, and what we're going to see play out over the next several decades in Gristle Hollow, is something that people who study these places have struggled to explain. It's not hauntings in the traditional sense. It's not the walking dead, not strange lights, not the kind of thing that resolves itself in a single night. It's slower than that. It's something that works the way geology works, over decades, over lifetimes, over generations, if you let it. In the spring of 1875, a woman arrived in Gristle Hollow. Her name was Renly Morse. She was 33 years old, lean and sharp-featured, with close-set eyes the color of creek water, and a way of standing that suggested she had never in her life arranged herself to seem less than she was. She had come from Jefferson City, where she had been working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods concern. She had left that position, according to the brief correspondence she had sent to Carveth, because she had received word that a relative had been among the men working in his camp, and she had not been able to reach that relative by letter for going on 8 months. The relative was Jessup Moreland. Renly and Jessup were not close by her own account. He was a second cousin, not someone she'd grown up with, not someone she'd had regular contact with as an adult. But she was a methodical woman, and the absence of any response to 8 months of letters struck her as something that required investigation rather than acceptance. She had no idea what she was riding into. Carveth received her with the particular discomfort of a man who knows something he cannot say. He told her that Jessup had disappeared in February of 1872 in a heavy snowstorm, and that despite extensive searching, he had not been found. He was presumed to have become lost and to have not survived the conditions. Renly sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "You don't believe that?" Carveth said nothing. She said, "I've read your letters about the camp. You're a precise man. Precise men don't lose workers in snowstorms without a better account than that." He said, "There are things that happen in this valley that I don't have better accounts for." She said, "Then I'd like to know what those things are." What followed, the conversation between Carveth Dunmore and Renly Morse over the course of her first week at the camp, is partially reconstructed from Renly's own journal, which survived in fragments in a family collection in Kansas City, and from a second ledger that Carveth apparently kept separately from the official operations log. The second ledger was found hidden in the frame of a wall when what remained of the camp structures was partially demolished in the 1930s. Carveth told her everything: Jessup, Haddon Fitch, the nightly wakings, the smell, the marks in the ground, Sully's explanation, incomplete as it was, the objects at the edge of the black pool, the sense, which had grown in him over 4 years, that the valley was doing something to the people who stayed in it. Taking something from them, or adding something? He wasn't sure which was worse. Renly listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question. She said, "Do you know who put those things in the ground at the pool?" He said, No, not in any specific way. Sully said it was old, before any living memory of the region, before the current inhabitants of the area had been here. He said the valley had been used for purposes he couldn't fully identify, by people whose methods he only partially understood. Renly wrote in her journal that night, "I don't know if Carveth is right about all of this, but I believe he believes it, and I believe he's the kind of man who doesn't believe things without good reason." She stayed, not for a week as she'd planned, not for a month. She stayed for 2 years, and in those 2 years she became the most methodical observer the valley ever produced. Renly Morse's journal, in the fragments that survive, is one of the more remarkable documents to come out of the Gristle Hollow period. She was not, it should be said, the kind of person who was inclined toward the supernatural. Her background was commercial and practical. She kept numbers. She understood ledgers. She had a clear, unornamented style of observation that made her notes feel less like testimony and more like surveyed data, which is part of what makes them so unsettling. She documented the wakings with a precision that the men hadn't managed. She tracked the frequency, every 3 to 5 nights, consistently, regardless of season. She tracked the time, always within 30 minutes of the same hour. She tracked the atmospheric conditions, whether it was raining or dry, warm or cold, and found that the wakings had no correlation with weather. They happened on their own schedule. She documented the smell. She described it more precisely than anyone else had managed, like the interior of a sealed stone room, like pressed clay, like iron that had been heated and then cooled somewhere without ventilation. Not a rotting smell, she was careful to note, not a decay smell, something older than decay. She documented the drift that Arvid had described. She confirmed his observation that the light in the valley behaved incorrectly on certain afternoons. She recorded the specific directions from which sound arrived at wrong distances. She made a map, crude but systematic, of the locations in the valley where the anomalies seemed strongest, and noted that they clustered in a rough arc in the southern half, with the black pool at the approximate center. And she documented something that no one before her had managed to articulate. She called it the thinning. She wrote, "There are moments, they last perhaps 15 seconds, perhaps as long as a minute, when the valley seems to become less dense, not the air, not the light, the substance of the place itself, as though the reality of this location were a cloth, and something on the other side were pulling it taut until it became nearly translucent. During these moments, I have the impression of depth. Not the depth of the valley that's visible at all times, but depth in the other direction, beneath the visible surface of things. It is not pleasant. It is also not, precisely speaking, frightening. It is something closer to recognition, as though what I am perceiving has always been there, and I am only occasionally capable of perceiving it." She was very careful with that last sentence. She crossed it out twice in her journal before leaving it. In the summer of 1876, the third disappearance happened, and this one was different. The man who vanished was Arvid Steen, the Tennessean who had been in the valley since the beginning, who had documented more of what happened there than anyone except Renly. He had been at Gristle Hollow for 5 years by then. He knew the valley as well as any of them. He disappeared in the middle of a workday, not at night, not during one of the wakings. In the middle of the afternoon, under a clear sky, while the men were working a section of slope 200 yards from the main camp, one of the other workers turned to ask him something, and he was gone. His axe was on the ground. His water jug was beside it. He had been standing there 30 seconds before. No sound, no indication of movement, nothing. Renly wrote about this in the most unguarded entry in the entire surviving journal. She wrote, "Arvid had been here the longest of any of them. He knew what was here. He paid attention. He took precautions that none of the others thought to take. I don't know what those precautions were, but I know he took them, and none of it mattered. It took him anyway, in broad daylight, with witnesses 30 feet away. I am starting to think that what Sully said was wrong. Not that attention doesn't matter, but that attention isn't protection. Maybe it's invitation. Maybe when you see it clearly enough, it sees you back." She left Gristle Hollow 3 weeks later. She never returned. In the last entry of her Ozark journal, written from a boarding house in the nearest town, she recorded, "I don't know if I left or if I was allowed to leave. I don't know if that distinction matters. I know that as soon as the valley was out of sight behind the first ridge, the feeling came, the one the others describe, the world outside the valley going flat and thin and less real. I felt it for 3 days. Then it faded. I expect it to come back. I don't expect to be able to explain this to anyone I try to tell." Carveth Dunmore ran the Gristle Hollow operation until 1879, when the useful timber in the accessible sections of the valley was largely exhausted. He lost 2 more men before the close. He kept records of all of it. When he finally dismantled the main camp and moved his operation to another location, he spent 3 days at Gristle Hollow alone after the other men had gone. Nobody knew what he was doing in those 3 days. He never said. The secondary ledger, found later in the wall of the old camp building, stops mid-sentence sometime during that period. The sentence reads, "I want to understand what I'm leaving behind, and whether leaving means anything to—" That's where it ends. Carveth ran timber operations in other parts of Missouri for another 20 years and died in 1904 at the age of 77. He had, by every account, a normal life after Gristle Hollow. He remarried. He had a prosperous business. He was remembered by his community as a capable, honest, unremarkable man. His family found the second ledger after his death. In his personal effects, they destroyed it before anyone outside the family could read it because what was in it frightened them. What we know of its contents comes from a brief, indirect account left by his eldest daughter, who wrote in a letter to a cousin. Father's notebook from his years in the southern hills contained things I cannot in good conscience repeat or preserve. I will say only that he believed with certainty that the valley in which he worked for 8 years was a location where the normal laws governing what is real and what is not do not apply, and that he had seen evidence of this with his own senses on more occasions than he could count. He did not believe in ghosts. He believed in something harder to name than that, something that had been put there deliberately long before any living memory, and that had not finished with what it had been put there to do. Gristle Hollow did not stay empty. It never does with places like this. By 1885, a small community had begun to form at the northern end of the valley. built around a grist mill that a man named Corbett Wise had constructed where the creek widened. Corbett was 40 years old, a miller by trade, originally from Kentucky. He had heard nothing about the timber operation that had preceded his arrival. The land was cheap, cheaper than it should have been for timber that good, for water that reliable, and he had a practical nature that was not disposed to ask too many questions about price. He built the mill. He built a house. He married a woman named Philora, who was 32 and had come from the same part of Kentucky. They had a quiet life at first. Philora kept a diary. It is one of the more complete surviving records from Gristle Hollow, because Philora was a dedicated writer who found in her diary a way of organizing experiences that otherwise threatened to overwhelm her, and because the diary was kept by her family in Kansas City, where it eventually came into the possession of a regional history library. The diary begins with the practical concerns of establishing a home, the difficulties of the mill construction, the management of the household, the qualities of the land and water and weather, and then gradually other things. Philora writes about the smell first. She had no way of knowing that other people had written about the same smell from the same valley. She described it as like the inside of a root cellar that has been sealed since before I was born. She notes that it comes at night, never during the day. She notes that Corbett has stopped mentioning it, though she knows he smells it too. She writes about the quality of silence in the valley. She writes, "It is not the silence of an empty place. It is the silence of a place where something is listening." And then, about 8 months after their arrival, she writes about the morning she woke at the usual hour and reached for Corbett and found his side of the bed empty. He was at the window, just standing there. She asked what he was looking at. He said, "Can't you see it?" She looked. The valley was dark outside, the way it always was before first light. Trees, hillside, creek, nothing else. She said, "I don't see anything." He said, "It's right there, at the edge of the tree line, just standing." She looked again. She still saw nothing. Corbett stayed at the window until the light came up. Then he turned around and went back to bed and slept for 2 hours. And when he woke, he said he had no memory of being at the window and didn't know what she was talking about. It happened again 4 nights later, and then again. And then it began to happen every few nights, reliably, until Philora stopped sleeping deeply enough to wake when he got up. She wrote, "I don't know if what he sees is there or not there. I believe he believes he sees it. I believe he is not the kind of man who invents things in the night. And I believe that something in this valley is doing this to him, and I don't know what to do about it." What makes it worse, she wrote, and this is perhaps the most unsettling passage in the entire diary, is that last week, just before the light came up, I looked again, out toward the tree line where he always looks, and I thought for just a moment that I could see something, not clearly, just a suggestion, a shape that was more organized than the surrounding darkness, a depth in the wrong direction. Then the light came, and it was gone, and now I'm not sure if I saw it or if I saw what Corbett is always looking for, and I don't know which is worse. The Wise family lived in Gristle Hollow for 11 years. In that time, 4 other families joined them at the northern end of the valley, drawn by the mill and by the relative availability of good land. A small general store was established, A church, non-denominational, practical, built from local timber, was raised in 1888. None of these families stayed longer than 7 years. They left for varying reasons, in varying conditions. Some left quietly and cleanly, with logical explanations and forwarding addresses. Others left abruptly, leaving behind furniture and tools and, in one case, a fully stocked pantry and a sleeping dog. Some left during the day, some left at night, in what the remaining residents could only describe as a state of great urgency. No one was seen leaving who didn't eventually arrive somewhere else. That's important to note. The disappearances, the kind that happened to Jessup Moreland and Haddon Fitch and Arvid Steen, seem to have been specific to the southern end of the valley, to the areas near the Black Pool and the objects buried at its edge. The northern settlement, built as far from that zone as the valley's geography allowed, lost its residents to fear and strangeness, but not to whatever it was that lived in the deep part. This distinction, if it is a real distinction, may be what preserved Corbett and Philora. When they finally left, in the late autumn of 1896, quietly and with their household goods carefully packed, Corbett had not seen the figure at the tree line in more than a year. Whether the valley had simply stopped showing it to him or whether something else had changed, he never said. Philora's diary ends with their departure. The last entry reads, "We are leaving today. I am not going to look back." I know that's a strange thing to write, and I don't know why I feel so certain about it. I just know that if I look back at the valley when we come over the first ridge, something will be different. Something will have changed, and I don't want to know what it is. I'm told she never spoke of Gristle Hollow again, not to her family, not to her neighbors in their next home, 3 states away, not ever. Corbett, for his part, spent the rest of his life working as a miller in a small town in Illinois and was, by every account, a steady and unremarkable man. He died in 1919 at the age of 73. His only documented reference to Gristle Hollow came in a conversation with a nephew, recorded in the nephew's own diary, in which Corbett said, "There are places in this country that are open in a way that other places aren't. Open to things that don't have names. You can live in them for a while. Some people live in them their whole lives, but they don't come through it the same as they went in. None of them do." He said this and then asked about something else entirely and never mentioned it again. The valley was not entirely uninhabited in the years following the departure of the Wise family and the other northern settlers. There is a category of person in the history of isolated American places. The Ozarks, the Appalachians, the deeper hollows of the rural South, who doesn't leave, who outlasts every settlement, every community, every wave of new arrivals, who is simply there, persistently, past the point, where they should reasonably still be there. In Gristle Hollow, that person was a man the various residents and visitors of the valley referred to simply as the mill keeper, because he continued to maintain the grist mill after Corbett Wise's departure, and because no one ever managed to get more specific information about him than that. His actual name, recovered from a single county record dated 1902, was Festus Drayle. Age at the time of the record, somewhere between 65 and 80, the registrar having been unable to pin it down more precisely. Occupation, listed as mill and property caretaker. Address: Gristle Hollow Valley, Missouri. Physical description from the same record, taken by a county assessor who visited the valley to survey what property remained. Tall, though stooped. Dark complexion. Eyes described as pale, almost colorless. Hands that the assessor noted as remarkable in size, larger than would seem usual even for a man of his build. Quiet in manner. Communicative, but brief. The assessor wrote in his notes, "Mr. Drayle has been in the valley by his own account since before the current settlement period. He is unwilling to specify how long. He maintains the mill in working order despite the absence of customers. When asked why, he said, someone has to tend it." When asked if he experienced any difficulties or irregularities in the valley, he paused for a considerable time and then said, "Nothing I haven't learned to live alongside." The assessor found this answer insufficient, but was, for reasons he couldn't articulate in his official report, disinclined to press further. Festus Drayle appears in 3 more records after the 1902 assessment, a county land survey from 1906, in which he is listed as occupant of the Gristle Hollow Mill property. A church roll from the nearest small town, dated 1910, listing him among residents of the surrounding area who had attended services during the previous year. And a brief article in a regional newspaper from 1917, reporting that a Mr. F. Drayle of the Southern Hills had been reported missing by a traveler who had stopped at the mill property and found it vacant. The article was 4 sentences long. It ran once and was never followed up. What the article did not mention, because the traveler who reported the disappearance had apparently chosen not to include this detail in his account to the newspaper, was what he had actually found at the mill. This detail comes from a letter the traveler, a dry goods salesman named Aldous Prentice, who was in his 50s and had been making a circuit through the southern Missouri hills for most of his adult life, wrote to his brother 2 weeks after the incident. Aldous wrote, "I have been going past that mill for 15 years on my route, and Festus has always been there. He wasn't always friendly, but he was always there. So when I found the mill emptied last September, I thought maybe he'd gone to town, or maybe he'd finally died, which was a thing I'd started to expect given his age. But the mill wasn't just empty, it was empty in the wrong way." Aldous went on to describe finding the mill in normal working order, the wheel turning, the mechanism sound, everything as it should be. But the living quarters at the rear had been disturbed, not ransacked, not broken into. Disturbed in the way that Aldous could only describe as though everything in the room had been picked up very carefully and set back down in slightly the wrong place, by someone who understood the correct arrangement of things, but had somehow gotten the proportions wrong. He wrote, "I know how that sounds," but that's what it was. His chair was where his chair should have been, but it was at an angle no one would actually sit in. His coat was on the peg, but hanging in a way that made it look like it was waiting for someone the wrong size. Even the light in the room was wrong. I don't know how to explain that. The light from the windows came in at the angle it should have at that time of day, but it didn't feel like it was landing right. He wrote, "I didn't stay long." He wrote, "I had been going past that mill for 15 years, and I am not a fanciful man, and I will tell you honestly that when I came back over the ridge onto the main road and Gristle Hollow was behind me, I took the longest breath I had taken in a long time. He wrote, "I don't think Festus left on his own. I don't think he left the way a person leaves. I think whatever was in that valley, whatever had been in that valley since before any of us had ever heard of it, I think it finally finished with him. Or maybe it finished what it started. I don't know the difference." After Festus Drayle's disappearance, Gristle Hollow was, for the first time in nearly 50 years, genuinely uninhabited. It stayed that way for a long time. The mill fell into disrepair without anyone to maintain it. The creek, which had always run cold, ran colder, in the way that happens to water in places where the trees have grown too tall and the sun doesn't reach the surface for more than a few hours a day. The structures that remained from the original camp, the ones that Corbett Wise's settlement had built around and then abandoned, slowly collapsed into the forest floor the way all wooden structures eventually do in that climate. The valley went back to itself. There are people today who live in the counties surrounding the area where Gristle Hollow used to be, and if you ask them about it, they will tell you different things. Some will tell you they've never heard of it. Some will change the subject. Some, the older ones who grew up in the hills and who know the particular language of places that are best left alone, will look at you for a moment before they answer. They'll look at you in a way that is neither frightened nor welcoming, a way that's measuring, deciding how much you need to know and whether knowing it will help or hurt you. And then they'll say some version of the same thing. They'll say, "There are places in these hills that were here before we were, and they'll be here after we're gone, and the best thing you can do is leave them to themselves. When you push, when you ask what's in those places, what makes them different, what happens to the people who don't leave them to themselves, they'll say, 'Nothing good,' and then they'll talk about something else. There is one final document in this story, and it is the strangest. It is a letter, undated, written on paper, that analysis has placed in the general period of the 1910s or 1920s, found tucked into the lining of a coat donated to a church rummage sale in a small Missouri town in the 1950s. The coat itself was old enough that the donation was noted with some surprise by the woman who received it. She said it looked like something her grandfather might have owned. The letter has no salutation and no signature. It reads in its entirety, "I have been trying to write this for a long time. I don't know who I'm writing it to. I don't think that matters. What I want to say is that the place is real, not in the way that real is usually used. I mean that it is more real than the things around it, more dense, more present, like it exists at a different pressure than the surrounding world. What happens to people there is not punishment. I want to be clear about that. It is not malevolent in the way that word is normally used. It doesn't want to cause suffering. It doesn't want anything, as far as I can tell, in any way that resembles wanting. It is simply doing what it does, what it was set up to do, by people who understood things that we have forgotten how to understand, and it will keep doing it for as long as it continues to exist. The things that were buried there are not symbols. They are not representations of something. They are functional. They are doing a specific thing in that specific location, and they have been doing it without interruption for longer than any living person has memory of. And whatever they are doing, it runs on the valley, on the specific configuration of water and rock and soil in that place. on the particular angle of the hills. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because I think someone should know. Maybe because I've been carrying it for too long and I need to put it somewhere outside myself. The valley is still there. It will be there when everything else I have known is gone. If you ever find yourself near it, I am asking you, as plainly as I can, do not go in. Not at night. Not in the day. Not out of curiosity. Not out of grief. Not for any reason that seems good enough in the moment. Nothing that valley has to offer is worth what it asks for in return. I know this because I stayed. I know this because I finally left. And I know this because every night at the same hour I wake up, and for just a moment before I remember where I am, I can smell it. That sealed room smell, that pressed clay smell, and somewhere underneath it, something I have never been able to name. And I think it still knows where I am. I think it always will. That's where the document ends. No name, no date, no way of knowing who wrote it, or whether they're still alive, or whether they were writing from direct experience or from something passed down to them. The coat itself is gone. It was old enough that no one thought to keep it. The letter was kept because the woman who found it read it and couldn't bring herself to throw it away. She said it felt, when she read it, like someone had handed her something heavy. She kept it in a box for 30 years. When she died, her daughter found it, read it, and kept it for another 15. And eventually it found its way to the people who research these things. The people who look for the places that don't make it onto maps the way they should. The places that were here before we arrived and that will be here long after we're gone. The valley is still there. I can tell you that much. What's in it? What's been in it since before any living memory doing what it was set up to do? I can only tell you what the people who stayed long enough found out. They found out that some places in this world exist at a different pressure than the rest, and that the pressure doesn't care whether you believe in it. It was there before you arrived, and it will be there when you're gone. And you, sitting with this right now, do you believe that there are places in this country where the rules are different? Where the land holds something that the official record never touches? Drop it in the comments. I read everything. If you have a story, something you've seen, something someone told you, something that happened in a place that doesn't get talked about, share it with us. Some of those stories become what we do next. Stay with us for the next one. Until then,